Midnight, she ran away from her father, but was already pregnant by him. A secret that remained buried for decades in the depths of the Ozark Mountains, in a community as isolated as the souls who lived there. This is the story of Martha Holloway, a young woman whose fate was sealed even before her birth, on a family line where the borders of kinship had been obscured for generations. 026, our account begins in 1952, when the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri housed hundreds of isolated communities, many of them virtually cut off from the modernizing America. In one of these forgotten valleys, about 40 kilometers from Branson, there was a property locally known as the Holloway Clearing. 047, there, 3 generations of the Holloway family had built a nearly self-sufficient existence with little outside contact. The 200-acre property was led by Samuel Holloway, a 43-year-old man widowed 5 years earlier after his wife Elizabeth died during the birth of their 6th son, who also did not survive. 108, Samuel was described by rare visitors as an imposing man, with a thick beard and grey eyes that rarely showed emotion. His word was law on the property where he lived with his 5 surviving children. What few knew was that the Holloway family already carried the burden of several generations of cousin marriage. Samuel himself was the son of first cousins, as was his late wife. 130, this pattern, which began as a way to keep land and goods within the family during the region's colonization in the 19th century, had become a rarely questioned custom, even as signs of genetic problems began to appear. Among Samuel's children, the 16-year-old Martha was considered the most beautiful and healthy. 152, petite in stature, with long brown hair and deep blue eyes that contrasted with her fair skin, Martha showed an intelligence and liveliness that seemed to have escaped the genetic fate affecting her younger brothers. John, 14, had severe learning difficulties. Thomas, 12, suffered from a spinal malformation that limited his movement. 216, Rebecca, 10, seemed normal but rarely spoke. And the youngest, Elijah, 8, was born with fused fingers, a condition that limited his dexterity. The family's isolation was not only geographic but also cultural and social. The Holloway children were educated at home by Samuel himself, who had studied to the equivalent of a high school level. 237, the religion practiced was a version of Christianity with Samuel as the supreme interpreter of Scripture. Contact with the outside world was limited to Samuel's monthly trips to town for supplies they couldn't produce, and rare family visits to the local church for Easter and Christmas. 310, in April 1952, however, this isolated balance was disturbed when the local Reverend Robert McIntyre convinced Samuel to let Martha participate in the church's youth activities, arguing the girl needed appropriate female companionship for her age. Reluctantly, Samuel agreed, possibly out of respect for religious authority, or perhaps because he saw in Martha a potential connection to a respectable regional family that could bring new opportunities. 332, for the next 2 months, Martha caught her first glimpse of the world beyond the Holloways. At Sunday activities, she met other girls, learned songs, joined picnics, and most importantly, was exposed to ideas and values different from those imposed by her father. It was through these interactions that Martha began to realize something was deeply wrong in her own family. 355, one day in June 1952, Martha confided a troubling concern to Sarah Bennett, the Reverend's wife. "Sometimes when my papa comes back from town, he looks at me in a way that gives me chills," said Martha. "It's like he's seeing me, but not as a daughter." Worried, Sarah asked if Samuel had done anything inappropriate, to which Martha responded only with silence and tears. 415, Sarah promised to speak with the Reverend about it. The following Sunday, however, Samuel announced Martha could no longer attend church activities, claiming she had too many responsibilities at home. When Reverend McIntyre visited the property to intervene, he was met with a shotgun and orders never to set foot on Holloway land again. 436, in the following weeks, nearby residents reported hearing shouts from the Holloway property at night. In mid-July, the eldest son of the nearest neighbor, while hunting, saw Martha alone washing clothes in the stream that cut through the property. He noticed bruises on her arms and a downcast expression that contrasted with the liveliness she'd shown at church. 459, in late July, during a particularly violent storm, Martha Holloway disappeared from the family property. Samuel Holloway appeared in town the next morning, visibly upset, asking if anyone had seen his daughter. An informal search was organized, but no sign of Martha was found nearby. Samuel publicly accused Reverend McIntyre of filling the girl's head with dangerous ideas and possibly helping her escape, accusations the clergyman vehemently denied. 529, the truth would only begin to emerge 2 weeks later, when Martha was found unconscious by the side of a road over 80 kilometers away, outside Springfield. Taken to the local hospital, the young woman was dehydrated, malnourished, and as the doctors soon discovered, approximately 2 months pregnant. 552, Martha's story reveals family secrets the system tried to bury for decades. Only here will you have access to never-before-revealed details about real cases the authorities preferred to forget. When Martha Holloway regained consciousness at Springfield Hospital in August 1952, she initially refused to give any information beyond her name. 613, the social worker assigned to the case, Eleanor Thompson, a 37-year-old known for her patience and compassion, spent days building a relationship of trust with the traumatized girl. Martha was like a wounded animal, Eleanor would recall years later in her personal diary, which only became public in 1998 after her death. 635, her eyes were constantly alert, watching for danger. She flinched at the slightest noise. It took a week before she would let me sit by her bed without trembling. Meanwhile, authorities identified Martha's family through fragmented school records and Reverend McIntyre's testimony. When informed of his daughter's whereabouts, Samuel Holloway immediately demanded her release and return to family custody, citing his rights as father and legal guardian. 704, it was during her second week of hospitalization that Martha finally began to share her story with Eleanor, in accounts interspersed with crying fits and long silences. Martha revealed the horror she had lived in the months before her escape. After I stopped going to church, Papa started locking me in the cellar when visitors came, said Martha. 726, he told my brothers I was sick. At night, after everyone was asleep. At this point, as Eleanor recorded, Martha would often break off, unable to verbalize the events. Over the days, the full picture emerged. Samuel had begun visiting Martha's room at night, initially just to watch her. According to the girl, these episodes evolved into forced intimacy, always accompanied by threats of punishment to her younger brothers if she resisted or told. 756, he said this was how families kept the bloodline pure, Martha told the social worker. He said my own Mama had been not just my mother, but my aunt too, and that it was normal for mountain families. The most disturbing revelation came when Martha explained why she had fled that particular July night. 816, I heard Papa talking to Uncle Jeremiah about marrying me to my cousin Walter when he got back from the army. Walter is Uncle Jeremiah's son with Aunt Catherine, who was my mama's sister. I knew I'd never get out of that cycle. Martha had planned her escape for weeks, hiding small amounts of food and saving the few cents she got when her father wasn't looking. 837, on the night of the storm, when the family's attention was on protecting the property from possible flooding, she slipped out her bedroom window with only the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing her few belongings. I walked for days, sleeping in barns and hitching rides when I thought it was safe, she said. 856, I just wanted to get to a place where nobody knew me, where I could start over. The case of Martha Holloway presented a complex legal and ethical dilemma for the 1952 authorities. On one hand, there were grave accusations against Samuel which, if proven, constituted heinous crimes. On the other, there was the social stigma surrounding issues of family intimacy, something rarely discussed openly at the time, especially in conservative rural communities. 927, District Attorney Howard Jenkins, a pragmatic middle-aged man known for his discretion, initially opted for a cautious approach. Instead of immediately filing criminal charges against Samuel Holloway, which would be hard to prove without physical evidence beyond Martha's testimony, Jenkins asked Judge William Kirchner to issue a temporary protective order barring Samuel from contacting his daughter. 951, Judge Kirchner, a 62-year-old known for his traditional views on family matters, surprised many by granting not only the protective order, but also ordering a broader investigation into the living conditions of Samuel Holloway's other children. The allegations made by the minor Martha Holloway are of so serious a nature that this court cannot ignore the possibility that other minors residing on the Holloway property may be at risk. 1021, the judge wrote in his August 28, 1952, decision. The subsequent investigation revealed a generational pattern of consanguineous relationships in the Holloway family dating back at least 4 generations. Parish records and birth certificates showed multiple marriages between first and second cousins, and in at least 2 prior cases, relationships between uncle and niece had been formalized through sham weddings. 1048, Dr. Harold Winters, a physician appointed to examine Martha's siblings, documented a series of conditions he attributed to the effects of prolonged consanguinity. All 4 minors present signs consistent with recurring genetic issues in consanguineous lines, including cognitive disabilities, physical malformations, and atypical development. 1111, there is clear danger for any future offspring. While the investigation continued, Martha remained in state care, first in the hospital and later in a temporary home run by Catholic nuns near Springfield. It was there, in September 1952, that Martha tried to take her own life upon learning her pregnancy had been confirmed beyond doubt. 1135, she ingested a significant quantity of cleaning products, said Sister Mary Catherine, the home supervisor. When we found her, she kept saying she couldn't bring another twisted creature into the world, that the blood was tainted, and it would be better for everyone if it ended there. After the suicide attempt, Martha was transferred to a psychiatric institution in St. Louis, where she remained under constant observation. 1157, doctors debated intensely about how to proceed with the pregnancy. In 1952, intentional termination was not only illegal in most circumstances but also considered morally unacceptable by much of society, even in extreme cases like Martha's. Dr. Lawrence Friedman, the chief psychiatrist on the case, described the ethical dilemma in his notes. 1225, the patient is clearly traumatized by the prospect of carrying a pregnancy resulting from improper relations with her own parent. The risk of another self-harm attempt is significant. Perhaps the patient's immediate psychological well-being would be better served by. While Martha wrestled with her reality in the psychiatric institution, Samuel Holloway finally faced legal consequences. 1251, on October 5, 1952, after weeks of investigation, prosecutor Howard Jenkins filed formal charges against Samuel, including child abuse, parental neglect, and improper conduct under tutelage, legal terms of the time that avoided explicit language about the crime's true nature. The local community reacted with a mix of shock, disbelief, and in some cases, defense of the accused. 1319, Samuel's always been a reserved man, but hardworking and God-fearing, a neighbor told the local paper. These charges must be a misunderstanding. Others, however, especially women in the community, expressed that they had always sensed something disturbing in the Holloway family dynamics. Those children never smiled, commented one church lady. 1341, and Martha, when she started coming on Sundays, she was like a flower blooming in the sun for the first time. There was a hunger in her eyes, not for food, but for something she'd never had. The winter of 1952 to 1953 was particularly harsh in the Ozarks. As snow covered the hills and valleys, further isolating rural communities, 3 parallel dramas unfolded involving the Holloway family members. 1408, at the St. Louis Psychiatric Institution, Martha Holloway, now 17 and in her 4th month of pregnancy, alternated between periods of deep depression and moments of unexpected clarity and determination. The medical team had stabilized her emotional state enough that she was no longer an immediate danger to herself, but the underlying trauma remained largely untouched. 1434, during therapy sessions, Martha began expressing concern not only for her own future, but for the fate of her siblings, wrote Dr. Friedman in January 1953. It is remarkable how, despite all she has suffered, she maintains a strong sense of responsibility toward the younger ones. Dr. Eleanor Blackwell, one of the few female psychiatrists practicing in Missouri at the time, gradually took over Martha's treatment. 3 p.m., under her care, the girl began to process her trauma through occupational and art therapy, activities considered innovative then. Martha shows a notable aptitude for drawing, said Dr. Blackwell. Her early drawings portrayed exclusively claustrophobic scenes, dark cellars, locked windows, dense, dead woods. 1523, in recent weeks, however, images of open doors and paths stretching beyond the horizon have begun to appear. In mid-January, a breakthrough occurred when Martha expressed for the first time curiosity about the baby she carried. She asked if the child would necessarily be born with problems, if there was any chance it could be normal despite the circumstances of its conception, said Dr. Blackwell. 1550, I explained as honestly and compassionately as I could that while the risk of genetic complications was higher due to consanguinity, it was not an absolute certainty. While Martha slowly rebuilt a sense of hope in St. Louis, the situation of her siblings became the subject of intense legal and social debate. 1610, following Samuel Holloway's arrest, the 4 minors were temporarily placed with different foster families, a decision the Child Welfare Department justified as necessary to properly assess each child's specific needs. John, the eldest brother at 14, was placed with the Pattersons, Methodist farmers experienced with children who had learning difficulties. 1632, Thomas, 12, due to his physical condition, was placed with the Williamses, a family where the father was a nurse who could assist with his care. Rebecca, 10, initially stayed with Reverend McIntyre's family, who felt particularly responsible for the Holloway children. The youngest, Elijah, 8, was taken in by the Coopers, a childless couple who had recently completed training as foster parents. 1659, the children's adjustment to these new environments was, as expected, challenging. The minors show behaviors consistent with prolonged social isolation and exposure to traumatic family dynamics, wrote social worker Marian Hendricks in her December 1952 follow-up report. Particularly notable is the 4 siblings' tendency to communicate with each other through gestures and expressions that appear to constitute a private language, possibly developed as a protective mechanism. 1729, Rebecca, the 10-year-old sister who rarely spoke, surprised everyone when, after 6 weeks with the McIntyres, she began to communicate verbally not with adults, but with the Reverend's daughter, a girl her own age. Mrs. McIntyre reported overhearing the girls talking in their shared room, with Rebecca describing in disturbing detail the special games her father made Martha play when he thought the other children were asleep. 1759, these additional revelations, though conveyed through a child's indirect testimony, served to further strengthen the case against Samuel Holloway, whose trial was set for March 1953. Samuel, meanwhile, remained in the county jail, refusing to admit any wrongdoing and insisting his family practices were protected by religious freedom and a father's natural right to rule his home. 1826, he found an unlikely ally in his court-appointed lawyer, Clayton Morris, an intensely religious man who, though personally revolted by the accusations, firmly believed in every defendant's constitutional right to a defense. My client categorically denies the allegations and maintains his actions have always been guided by his family's welfare, Morris told the local press. 1850, we questioned the reliability of a troubled teenager's testimony and the legality of how the children were removed from the family residence. A third drama unfolded on the Holloway property itself, now abandoned and under continued investigation. In January 1953, during a thorough search of the premises, authorities discovered a hidden compartment under the main house floor containing family documents dating back to 1865. 1917, among them was a diary belonging to Josiah Holloway, Samuel's great-grandfather and the family's original patriarch in the region. The diary entries, written between 1865 and 1883, revealed a disturbing philosophy that had apparently guided family practices for generations. The outside world is tainted, but we Holloways will keep our blood pure. 1942, Josiah wrote in 1872. Every union with strangers dilutes our essence. Each marriage within the family strengthens our legacy. This is how we survive when others fail. Other entries described how Josiah had gradually isolated his family from the wider community, establishing a belief system mixing distorted biblical interpretations with popular pseudoscientific theories of the late 19th century. 2013, a particularly revealing entry dated 1879 described how Josiah had arranged the marriage of his eldest daughter, then 14, to her own younger uncle, the girl's uncle. Elizabeth resisted at first, as expected of her stubborn nature. After 3 weeks in the smokehouse cellar, she finally accepted the divine will and her duty to the purity of our line. 2038, the discovery of these documents provided not only additional evidence against Samuel, but a broader historical context for understanding how abusive practices had been perpetuated for generations, camouflaged under a facade of religious isolation and self-sufficiency. 2102. If your heart has tightened thinking of the silent pain Martha carried, comment now. Martha deserves justice. This simple act shows you see beyond appearances and recognize the suffering of those who cannot speak for themselves. On March 10, 1953, Samuel Holloway's trial finally began in the county courthouse, an event that drew attention not only from the local community but from journalists in St. Louis and Kansas City. 2125. The case had gained regional notoriety, less for the specific details of the accusations, which newspapers of the time treated with extreme caution and veiled language, and more for what it represented: the tension between isolationist family practices and evolving social and legal standards in the post-war era. 2144. Prosecutor Howard Jenkins, aware of the case's sensitivity and the difficulty of obtaining convictions in cases involving intimate family relations at that time, built his argument around the most easily provable aspects of Samuel's behavior: the forced isolation of the children, deprivation of adequate education, the unsanitary conditions discovered on the property, and the physical neglect documented by the doctors who examined the younger children. 2214. Jenkins's strategy was complemented by expert testimony contextualizing the dangers of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Harold Winters, who had examined the siblings, presented photographic and medical evidence of the children's physical and cognitive conditions, which he directly attributed to the deleterious effects of reproduction within a restricted genetic group over multiple generations. 2241. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a geneticist from the University of Missouri called as a specialist witness, explained to the jury, when closely related people have children, the risk that the child inherits two copies of a potentially harmful gene increases significantly. The chance of a negative outcome is much greater. 2306. Martha, now in advanced pregnancy, did not attend court in person. Instead, her testimony was entered as a deposition previously recorded before a judge, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney. The decision not to expose the girl to the additional trauma of facing her father in court was made on the strong recommendation of Dr. Blackwell, who warned such a confrontation could trigger a severe relapse in Martha's psychological state. 2329. Samuel's defense, in turn, focused on challenging the credibility of Martha's testimony and presenting the defendant as a strict but devoted father whose family isolation practices were motivated by sincere religious conviction and a desire to protect his children from modern society's corrupting influence. 2356. The charges against my client represent nothing less than the criminalization of traditional family practices and religious beliefs handed down for generations, argued Clayton Morris in his opening statement. Mr. Holloway raised his children as he believed was right, according to the values passed down by his father, and his father's father before him. 2400 hours 19. Morris called as witnesses several members of the wider Ozark community who, while not knowing the Holloways intimately, attested that family isolation and self-sufficiency were common and respected practices in the region, and that government interference in family affairs was traditionally viewed with suspicion. 2400 hours 40. The most controversial testimony came from Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's brother and the children's uncle, who had been mentioned in Martha's account as complicit in the plan to marry her to her cousin. Jeremiah, a 41-year-old man strikingly similar to Samuel, denied any knowledge of improper behavior by his brother and described the Holloways as reserved but decent. 25:06. When questioned by the prosecutor about documented consanguineous marriages in the family history, including his own marriage to his first cousin Catherine, Jeremiah responded with disturbing frankness. "Where I come from, you marry who you know and who you trust. And who do you know better than your own family? Might seem strange in the city, but in the hills, it's just the way to survive." 25:30. The trial lasted 7 days, during which the local community divided into factions. While most expressed horror at the revelations about Holloway practices, a vocal minority defended Samuel's right to raise his family according to his beliefs, seeing the case as an example of government overreach into the family autonomy many mountain inhabitants deeply valued. 25:55. On March 17, 1953, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Wilson, after hearing additional arguments from both sides on the appropriate sentence, sentenced Samuel Holloway to 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 15. 26:25, this court has rarely seen a case of such prolonged and systematic abuse of parental authority, Judge Wilson said, pronouncing sentence. While we recognize parents' rights to raise children according to their religious beliefs, this right finds its absolute limit when it endangers the physical, mental, and moral well-being of minors under their care. 26:49, the sentence was met with silent approval by most in the courtroom, including several members of the local religious community who had initially defended Samuel. Reverend McIntyre, present throughout the trial, later commented the case had forced many in the community to confront a darkness we preferred to believe didn't exist among us. 27:09, as Samuel Holloway was taken to begin his sentence in the state penitentiary, a new chapter opened for Martha. On March 26, 1953, at 38 weeks gestation, she went into labor at the St. Louis Hospital, accompanied by Dr. Blackwell, who had become her confidant and protector. After 14 hours of labor, Martha gave birth to a girl who, surprisingly, showed no immediately apparent physical abnormalities. 27:32, Dr. Spencer Reynolds, the pediatrician who examined the newborn, noted cautiously, the infant has normal reflexes. All fingers and toes are present and well-formed, with no visible signs of the facial or cranial abnormalities often associated with close consanguinity. However, some conditions may only manifest later in development. 27:52, the question of the child's future had been intensely debated in the preceding months. Under normal circumstances of the time, an unmarried teenage mother would have been strongly pressured to give the baby up for adoption, especially given the traumatic conception. However, Dr. Blackwell had argued vehemently that forcing Martha to separate from her daughter against her will would constitute an additional, unnecessary trauma. 28:20, after observing the evolution of Martha's attitude toward the pregnancy, I am convinced she has developed a genuine bond with the child she carries, Dr. Blackwell wrote in her official recommendation to family court. To separate mother and daughter at this juncture would be to inflict further trauma on a young woman who has endured more than anyone should. 28:40, with proper support, I believe Martha has the capacity to be a loving and competent mother, turning tragic circumstance into an opportunity for healing and redemption. The court, influenced by the respected psychiatrist's recommendation and the case's unusual precedents, granted Martha provisional custody of the newborn, whom she named Hope. 29:02, Hope Elizabeth, a name reflecting her vision for the future. In the weeks following Hope's birth, Martha was transferred to a transitional home run by a progressive religious organization in Jefferson City. The program, uncommon for the time, was designed specifically to support young mothers in difficult circumstances, offering housing, continuing education, and vocational training while allowing the women to retain custody of their children as they built independent lives. 29:34, Martha shows impressive dedication to both her studies and the baby's care, wrote Mrs. Patricia Donovan, the program coordinator, in her April 1953 evaluation. Despite her youth and the traumatic circumstances that brought her to us, she displays notable maturity and determination. Beyond her daughter's welfare, she remains concerned about the fate of her younger siblings. 29:56, indeed, the situation of Martha's siblings had become a complex case for the social welfare system. After months of observation in foster homes, detailed medical and psychological evaluations had been completed for each child, revealing a worrying picture of the effects of prolonged isolation and consanguinity. 30:17, John, the eldest brother, was diagnosed with moderate intellectual disability that significantly limited his academic learning capacity, though he showed surprising practical skills, particularly in woodworking and handicrafts. Thomas, whose spinal malformation was the most visible initial symptom, also had congenital heart problems requiring corrective surgery. 30:42, Rebecca, whose reluctance to speak was initially attributed to psychological trauma, was diagnosed with a specific form of partial hearing impairment affecting her ability to process certain vocal frequencies. Only Elijah, the youngest, despite the syndactyly fused fingers affecting his hands, seemed to have cognitive development near normal for his age, though with significant social delays. 31:06, a case conference in May 1953 brought together social workers, doctors, special educators, and court representatives to decide the long-term future of the Holloway children. The unanimous decision was that none of the children could return to the family property, even under relative supervision, an option complicated by the fact that the investigation had revealed virtually all adult Holloway relatives were implicated, to varying degrees, in the system of consanguineous marriage and social isolation. 31:40, the minors John, Thomas, Rebecca, and Elijah Holloway require levels of specialized medical and educational intervention impossible to ensure in a conventional family setting in their region of origin, the official report concluded. We recommend permanent placement in institutions that can meet their specific needs, with provisions to maintain contact between the siblings and their older sister, Martha. 32:06, this recommendation, though made with the best intentions and based on professional assessments, reflected the era's predominant approach to children with special needs, institutionalization, a decision that would be widely re-evaluated and criticized in later decades as deinstitutionalization and community integration became preferred approaches. 32:31, but in 1953, it seemed the most responsible option available. Martha reacted to the news with a mix of resignation and determination. She understands her siblings need care she can't provide right now, Dr. Blackwell said after telling Martha of the decision. But she made me promise they wouldn't be forgotten, that they wouldn't disappear into some anonymous system. 32:52, they were invisible long enough, she said. In the following months, as Martha adapted to motherhood and continued her own recovery, she showed extraordinary resilience. She completed the equivalent of a high school diploma through an accelerated program, learned typing and administrative skills, and began planning a future that had seemed impossible just a year before. 33:16, in September 1953, a significant turn occurred when a routine medical checkup revealed Hope had a subtle developmental delay, possibly indicative of underlying neurological issues. The doctors couldn't determine for sure if this was related to consanguinity or simply a normal developmental variation, but the discovery affected Martha deeply. 33:39, she spent 2 whole nights sleepless, just watching her daughter, said Mrs. Donovan. When she finally spoke of it, Martha said something I'll never forget. No matter what comes for Hope, she will never know what it is to be invisible or disposable. She will know she is loved, exactly as she is. 34:08, Martha's commitment to Hope's welfare, despite the traumatic conception and potential developmental challenges, deeply impressed the professionals working with her. Dr. Reynolds, who continued to monitor Hope's development, noted, "I have rarely witnessed such an intense and healthy mother-daughter bond, especially given the mother's age and underlying trauma. Miss Holloway seems to possess a remarkable ability to wholly separate the child from the circumstances of her conception." 34:28, in November 1953, 9 months after Samuel Holloway's trial, an unexpected incident brought the case back into public attention. Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's brother who had testified in his defense, was arrested after an investigation prompted by his own wife, Catherine. Catherine, hospitalized with serious injuries she initially claimed were from a fall, confided to a nurse she had actually been assaulted by her husband after questioning his attention to their own 13-year-old daughter, Beth. 35:01, the nurse, alerted by parallels to the recent Holloway case, notified authorities. The subsequent investigation revealed Beth Holloway showed signs of inappropriate intimate experience, and the girl eventually confirmed her father had begun visiting her at night after her uncle Samuel's trial, telling her it was now her duty to keep the family tradition alive. 35:24, Jeremiah Holloway was arrested and charged with crimes similar to his brother's. During a search of his property, about 10 kilometers from the original Holloway clearing, authorities discovered a collection of correspondence between Jeremiah and Samuel spanning decades, explicitly documenting how the family had systematically perpetuated consanguineous practices for generations, justifying them through a distorted blend of religiosity, pseudoscientific theories of blood purity, and paranoid distrust of the outside world. 36:00, the most disturbing letter, written by Samuel to Jeremiah just 3 months before Martha's escape, detailed, "I am preparing Martha to continue our pure line. She carries the best of our blood with few of the defects affecting the others. If Walter doesn't return from the army in time, it may be best for me to sire the next generation myself." 36:21. These additional revelations not only retroactively strengthened the case against Samuel but exposed the systematic extent of abusive practices within the wider Holloway clan, leading to a broader investigation that would eventually implicate 3 more adult members of the extended family in similar behavior. 36:42. For Martha, the news about her uncle brought complex feelings. She expressed both validation, as her testimony was fundamentally corroborated, and deep sadness for her cousin Beth, now facing trauma similar to her own. Dr. Blackwell reported Martha specifically requested the chance to write Beth a letter, saying perhaps the only person who can truly understand what she's going through is someone who's lived the same nightmare. 37:09. Martha's letter to Beth, preserved in the case archives and later published with permission as part of a study on survivors of family trauma, became a remarkable document for its compassion and wisdom beyond the author's years. "Dear Beth, you don't know me, but we are cousins. More importantly, we are survivors of the same darkness. 37:29. I want you to know 3 things it took me a long time to learn, but that changed everything for me. First, what happened was not your fault. Nothing you did or could have done caused it. Second, you are not tainted or ruined. What they did to our bodies does not define who we are. And third, there is a world waiting where we get to decide who we will be." 37:52. The summer of 1954 brought significant changes for Martha Holloway and her daughter Hope, now 15 months old. Thanks to her exceptional performance in Dr. Blackwell's transitional program and the continuing support of the psychiatrist, who had become not just her therapist but an informal mentor, Martha secured a job as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic in Columbia, Missouri. 38:17. Far enough from the Ozarks to offer a fresh start, but close enough to allow regular visits to her siblings. Martha demonstrates a remarkable ability to transform her traumatic experience into motivation to help others, said Dr. William Harrington, the clinic director who hired her. Her natural empathy, combined with her first-hand knowledge of system failures, makes her exceptionally effective in helping patients navigate complex social and medical services. 38:50. Hope, while showing mild developmental delays requiring regular therapy, was a cheerful, affectionate child. Doctors remained cautiously optimistic, noting many of the problems they initially feared had not materialized. While some subtle fine motor coordination and sensory processing difficulties are present, the child demonstrates cognitive and emotional development within acceptable parameters for her age. 39:19, wrote Dr. Reynolds in his June 1954 follow-up. Martha established a structured routine, dividing her time between work, Hope's care, and monthly visits to her siblings, who were housed in 2 different institutions, John and Thomas at the Hadley Institute for Special Needs, and Rebecca and Elijah at the Springfield State Center for Children's Rehabilitation. 39:40, though the institutions were over 100 kilometers apart, Martha made a point of visiting both regularly, often traveling hours by bus to spend a few precious hours with each pair. The effect Martha's visits have on the behavior and emotional well-being of the Holloway children is remarkable, said Dr. James Peterson, a psychologist at the Hadley Institute. 40:01, John in particular, who typically shows little emotional response to social interactions, transforms completely in his sister's presence. His speech becomes clearer, his affect more appropriate, and he displays a sense of humor otherwise hidden. In October 1954, a significant event occurred when Reverend McIntyre and his wife, who had kept in touch with Martha throughout the process, visited Columbia with an unexpected proposal. 40:47, the couple, now in their 50s with grown children who had left home, offered to adopt Rebecca and Elijah, Martha's 2 younger siblings who presented the least severe medical challenges. "After much prayer and reflection, we've concluded God is calling us to offer these children a home," Reverend McIntyre explained to Martha. 41:08, "We can't undo what was done to them, but we can offer a loving family and the care they deserve." The proposal put Martha in an emotionally complex position. On one hand, the opportunity for her younger siblings to be in a genuinely loving family environment, rather than an institution, seemed an unexpected miracle. On the other, she felt deep responsibility for all her siblings and worried that separating from John and Thomas could feel like abandonment. 41:28, after weeks of intense conversation with Dr. Blackwell, additional visits to both institutions, and long discussions with the McIntyres about their expectations and commitments, Martha finally gave her support to the adoption. "The most important thing to me is that they know they're still my brothers and sister, that we're still a family, just organized differently now," she explained to the McIntyres. 41:52, the adoption process, begun in November 1954, faced significant bureaucratic hurdles, partly due to the high-profile case associated with the children and partly due to institutional policies of the time that often discouraged adopting children with special needs. However, with support from several professionals who had worked on the Holloway case, including Judge Kirchner and Dr. Blackwell herself, the process moved forward. 42:18, in April 1955, the court finally approved the adoption of Rebecca and Elijah by the McIntyres, with the specified condition that Martha retain regular visitation rights. The McIntyres, demonstrating a remarkably progressive understanding for the time, not only accepted this condition but actively embraced it, recognizing Martha's vital role in her siblings' emotional lives. 42:45, "We are not replacing Martha as a family figure," Mrs. McIntyre explained during the final adoption hearing. "We are simply expanding the circle of love and support around these children, who have already suffered more than any child should." Rebecca and Elijah's transition to the McIntyre home occurred gradually throughout the summer of 1955, with initial visits, followed by weekend stays, and finally a permanent move in August. 43:14, Martha participated actively in the process, working with therapists and educators to make the transition as untraumatic as possible. John and Thomas, meanwhile, remained at the Hadley Institute, where they continued receiving the specialized care their conditions required. John, now 17, had developed considerable woodworking skill under a patient instructor, creating surprisingly intricate and beautiful pieces despite his cognitive limitations. 43:44, Thomas, 15, had undergone 2 corrective surgeries for his spinal condition and, though still facing significant mobility challenges, showed consistent progress in physical rehabilitation. Martha continued to visit them faithfully, bringing Hope along to ensure the girl knew her uncles from an early age. "It's important to me Hope grows up understanding family isn't defined by what looks normal to others, but by love and commitment." 44:18, Martha explained to Dr. Blackwell during one of her now less frequent sessions, conducted more as well-being check-ins than intensive therapy. In November 1955, an unexpected development occurred when Martha received a letter from Samuel Holloway, sent from the state prison where he was serving his sentence. It was Samuel's first